Get ready to rumble. Shilling Show Unleashed on the Seven Thunders Media Network. Former city councilor, husband, father, and community watchdog. Your host, Rob Schilling.
Welcome to the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Remember, your direct support makes our show possible, and you can directly support this podcast by visiting shillingshow.com and then clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page to make a monthly contribution. We appreciate your support. It never ends. I'm talking about taxing and spending and taking a look today at the Albemarle County Board of Supervisors, in particular Supervisor Diantha McKeel, who has come up with another risky tax scheme. You recall a couple years ago there was discussion of a rain tax, quote unquote, in Albemarle County, where they wanted to implement additional taxes based on the amount of impervious surface on your property, all sorts of calculations, just another way to grab money from the public. So what is it this time? Well, it came out late in a recent Board of Supervisors meeting when the supervisors were asked by the chair if they had anything else they'd like to say. And Supervisor McKeel started to talk about the plastic grocery bag tax. Now, if you've ever traveled to Washington, D.C., you've had the pleasure of spending an extra 5 cents for every plastic bag that you want to use when you shop at a store there. It is mandated by the government that they tax you, in essence, for something they were giving you along with your purchase previously. And then, of course, the government reaps the windfall. The grocery store has to be the bag man, and we all pay higher prices. So what about the timing of all of this? Well, Diantha McKeel, I guess, thinks it's just fine here on the heels of a pandemic that we start increasing prices for everybody who's buying groceries. I've been to the grocery store recently. I've seen what the prices have done. I've seen how the packages have been shrinking, and even things like the dosage of medicines. Now, although the bottle looks to be the same size, it's only half as potent, requiring you to take 2 spoonsful instead of 1 to get the same dose. This is what's happening all around us, and Diantha McKeel wants to raise taxes. She wants to tax us on plastic bag uses. Well, what about the quote-unquote poor and low income? Well, she has a solution for that. For the poor and low-income people, we're going to give them free reusable bags. There's been a lot of study about reusable bags that you use in grocery stores, and they test them. They're full of bacteria. So is Diantha McKeel proposing a 2-tiered system wherein those who can afford it will get clean plastic bags, but those who can't afford it will be relegated to quote-unquote free reusable bags? They just won't tell you about all the bacteria and other health dangers that accompany reusable bags. There's a reason that some things are disposable. There's a reason that we don't reuse needles and Band-Aids and toothbrushes and many other things, because they get dirty. Even face masks get dirty and can't be reused. But this is the proposal that's at hand, and it's apparent from the discussion that took place at the Board of Supervisors level that this is a long-time scheme. The county attorney, Mr. Kampner, referenced that the board had agreed to postpone the discussion of this issue until after the pandemic because the grocery stores were, quote unquote, stressed during the pandemic. Well, the grocery stores are still stressed. This has been a terrible time for everybody. All of us are still stressed, and yet that was not enough to dissuade Diantha McKeel from going forward with glee. In fact, she was so happy that another locality, Roanoke, had become the first in Virginia to implement a 5 cent per bag grocery bag tax. She said, Diantha, we ought to be watching Roanoke learn from all their mistakes, in essence, and then bam, we drop the hammer on every person in Albemarle County who shops at Kroger, who shops at Giant or Aldi or Lidl or Harris Teeter or any of the others. Yes, they're all going to pay it. We're all going to pay it. And this is what you get when you elect all Democrats to the Board of Supervisors in Albemarle County. Not a single voice in opposition that I could hear. This sounds like a fait accompli. The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast will continue in just a moment.
Online at shillingshow.com.
Border Hawk BorderHawk.News is a one-stop shop with the latest news about immigration nationalism and globalism. The BorderHawk staff daily curates immigration news stories and, in the fashion of the Drudge Report, updates the site with cutting-edge content and original first-class commentary. BorderHawk.News highlights national and international media reports, tweets, and nuggets buried in local news blurbs, polls, video clips, and policy research. BorderHawk is pro-legal immigration, pro-rule of law, but against an unsecure border, as countless Americans have suffered violence at the hands of criminal illegal aliens. And an increasing number of Americans are concerned about how mass migration affects their daily life. BorderHawk.News will remain on the forefront of the immigration issue with a buffet of info to read, evaluate, and share. Bookmark BorderHawk.News. Add them on social media at BorderHawkNews on Twitter.
Shilling Show Unleashed.
The Shilling Show Unleashed podcast continues, and we welcome Randy Clark, a freelance writer and retired United States Border Patrol Division Chief of Operations. We've got a lot of trouble at the border and beyond. We're going to talk about it today. Randy Clark, welcome to the Shilling Show Unleashed.
Good morning.
I'd like for you to tell us, first of all, because I'm always curious about people who are involved, how and why you became involved in Border Patrol.
So at an early age, I had a very big interest in law enforcement, and I grew up on the border. So I grew up about a mile from the nearest Border Patrol station. So I was relatively familiar with what the Border Patrol did. I certainly didn't find out for sure until I joined. But as I grew up, I kind of directed myself to that, and I joined the Border Patrol in January of 1988.
Do you ever have any regrets of your service? I know you served for 30 years, and I always want people to look back on their time. Any regrets at all?
No, none whatsoever. It was an incredible opportunity to serve, and I think that service comes to a lot of people. That service primarily, from the Border Patrol is to the citizens of the United States. We're a national security agency, and then the service is to those people we encounter every single day out in the field. The migrant population is a very vulnerable one. There's human trafficking, there's child trafficking, and then there's a lot of people in very harsh environments that find themselves, in need of rescue.
It's interesting that you say that, and I've interviewed a lot of people who've worked for the Border Patrol and for ICE, and I have never heard anybody with regrets, which just speaks to the fact that the organization is respected not only from within, but also from people who know what you're doing across the country. We appreciate your service there. I want to use a term here as we get into the current border situation, and I've been using this term because it appears to be accurate. I call it the former southern border of the United States. Is there any truth in that?
I guess I would have to agree somewhat. We've seen a big change in dynamics along the border. It is not the same border that we had 32 years ago when I joined the Border Patrol. We've seen a big demographic change. A lot of that was due to the 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act that immigrated well over 3 million people. So we've seen a lot of demographic changes, and I would say that's a very accurate description.
I have personally, although it's been a long time, crossed both the northern and the southern borders. And when I was crossing into Canada, I was struck by how closely we were monitored and checked. I was in a musical group and I was crossing the border to perform, but we were stopped there for hours as they went through all of our equipment and asked us a lot of questions. So are there differences between the northern and southern border of the United States and the situations that we face there?
So I would say the difference is going to be volume. We all know that the busiest ports of entry are going to be located along the southern border. And then in between ports of entry, that's where you're going to see the largest number of illegal immigrants entering, narcotics trafficking. So where there's more time to inspect, a more thorough inspection will occur. Where you are absolutely busy, you're going to have to prioritize those folks you give a closer look to.
I want to talk about the increase in traffic at the southern border of the United States, particularly in the last several months under this new administration. But what are the numbers like?
So right now, the Border Patrol is apprehending a little over 170,000 illegal aliens per month. That's in stark contrast to what they were looking at during the same time frame a year previous. A year previous, it was about 36,000. So the increase is over 250% from one year over the other. And the sharpest increases, of course, came right after January when we went into the new presidential transition.
What specific policies or what statements have been made, because maybe that's it, that have changed these numbers?
Well, I think there was a lot of campaign rhetoric. In one of the Democratic debates, I think President Biden clearly stated he encouraged an immediate surge at the border, that he wanted those asylum claims to be heard. And I think they heard him loud and clear. And then I think immediately after election, those actions that took place to undo months and months of agreements with Northern Triangle countries, El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. There were numerous agreements made with those countries to facilitate removal and to make sure that there were safe countries that they could apply for asylum before they got to the southern border. So that's what got us to the 36,000 a month last year, were those agreements, and they were immediately undone. So I think when you marry up the campaign rhetoric with action, and they see those programs that are going to facilitate removal, such as the migrant protection protocols, which we all call the wait in Mexico for asylum, where if we arrest, and I say we, the Border Patrol arrest, you're going to expect that you're going to go back to Mexico and wait. And we know about 30% of those, roughly estimated, return to their home country. And I've spent a lot of time on the southern border in really where ground zero is in the Rio Grande Valley. And I'm fluent in Spanish, I've interviewed dozens and dozens and dozens of people coming into the country illegally right at landfall. And what I'm finding is it's really not a claim of asylum. It's an economic issue. There are no jobs, and it's extreme poverty.
So I guess the question I would have for you, Randy Clark, is given that information, the policymakers in the United States of America must know that we can't solve the world's problems by making our own problems worse, which is what this is doing. So how do they justify all this?
I think that's a very, very deep question. And if you look at the actions, it's really not one person driving this. You can't pin this all and say, well, I think the president wants these things to happen. I think you have to look at some of the rhetoric that we heard before that about defunding the police, about abolishing ICE, about getting rid of Department of Homeland Security, Customs and Border Protection, that there's no need for those folks. So I think maybe you and I might agree that we can't solve the world's problems, but I don't think everybody agrees with us. And I think there's some folks in power. I think you have some congressional backing that are on the far left that believe we really can solve, and we will. If you look at what's coming up in the future, it kind of spells that out. We have abolished ICE through policy. We did not have to defund them. Early on, there was a priorities memorandum that went to ICE that said, hey, we're going to look at these things, and we're going to deport terrorists primarily, then we're going to deport some very, very serious criminal offenders, and past that, if you want to do any enforcement, you have to get permission from Washington, D.C. And what that means is their work effort and their workload has reduced by 2/3. They talk about limited resources, but they have the same resources they did last year, but they're doing 1/3 of the work because of those priorities. And those will be finalized by the DHS secretary based on the executive order from President Biden. And that may even become more restrictive. We don't know. But I know, talking to a lot of colleagues that I've had in ICE, they are very, very frustrated. So in essence, by policy, ICE has almost been abolished with the same funding, doing about 1/3 of the removals that they did prior to January.
It's terrible news to receive, but I think it's important for people to know. Also, I think it's important for people to understand the impact on state and local law enforcement. I've interviewed sheriffs like Joe Arpaio and Paul Babu and others from Arizona who just tell these stories that are almost impossible to believe of what they have to deal with in the situation. Tell us more.
Well, I visited with local constables, Texas Highway Patrol, and even our local sheriff here and in Del Rio, and they're seeing the same thing. We had an accident last month in Del Rio where 9 people were killed by human traffickers. Luckily, the U.S. citizens that were traveling that were involved in this head-on collision, they sustained serious injuries, but they survived. But 9 illegal aliens were ejected from a pickup truck, and they all died. That's happening on our highways every single day. The constables that I talk to on the I-35 corridor that stretches from Laredo, Texas, all the way to Minnesota, they're seeing a surge in pursuits. And the cartels are getting a windfall with this increased traffic. They are making millions, hundreds of millions a month on the increase in traffic because they charge to cross that river. Well, it's very hard for the Border Patrol to make those interdictions in every case because they're taking care of thousands, about 5,000 illegal apprehensions per day. That's 15,000 meals the Border Patrol has to feed. And they have some contract help, but it's not enough. So they're out of the field, and it leaves local law enforcement and the commuting public on the highways to deal with those increases in danger. And what we're seeing is the cartels have started using social media to recruit drivers. Well, these are not experienced human smugglers. They have no mercy on folks. These are young kids, 20, 21, 22, 23, that are trying to earn a few $1,000s to get a vehicle from, let's say, Laredo, Texas to San Antonio. Where they are finding them in some cases is drug rehab centers. We've seen some that die in our custody right after apprehension because they swallow fentanyl or methamphetamines, and they overdose in our cells or they overdose on the scene of the arrest. That's what we're looking at, people who really are a danger to the communities. And the constables and police officers, they're pretty much sick and tired of it.
I can well imagine. And Randy, I've also talked to a lot of the border ranchers, and several in particular come to mind, who have these stories of their property just being trespassed upon and all sorts of things happening there. And there seems to be nothing they can do because the local law enforcement seems totally overwhelmed.
They are. Many of these departments, especially in the South Texas region. I just spoke to a sheriff a few weeks ago. He's got 6 deputies, and he's got thousands and thousands of square miles to patrol. So he's not spending the time guarding his constituents' property like he would like to. He's spending them on the highway in these high-speed pursuits and these accidents. And so it takes away from what the community expects out of their elected sheriff and the sheriff's department because they don't get the services that they should. So they're kind of left all alone. Those that are escaping apprehension are the ones that those ranchers are seeing. Right now, we know 200,000 illegal aliens have eluded apprehension this fiscal year, which started in October. In all of the 12 months previous, there were 60,000. So we see that number has increased dramatically. Where will it be when we get back to the next fiscal year in another 5 months? That's really where we're at right now. It is taxing everybody. I live a mile from the Rio Grande River. I'm hearing helicopters almost daily over my house, down the street. It's really everywhere along the southern border. And it's demonstrated when you can see that some of the congressmen right now that are Democrats, Henry Cuellar comes to mind, that's very, very vocal because, like they say, all politics are local. He's hearing from constituents, and I've talked to some of them in the Rio Grande Valley and Roma, in Mission, that they're not getting sleep. You know, one lady who lives in Roma, Texas, she lives right where the buses park to pick up the migrants. They average sometimes 300 to 500 per night surrendering to Border Patrol. Those are the family units, those that immediately are going to get released. And she says, we can't sleep. It's like a bus station outside. One bus leaves, another one comes, and it idles all night outside our bedroom windows. And they're frustrated, but it doesn't appear as if anybody's listening to that.
Yeah, this is I think the great frustration across the country is, you know, we hear individual Congress people speaking out about this, and we have a good congressman here in Virginia's 5th District, but Congress will not do anything, at least under the present leadership. So what about the governors, and what steps can your governor take in Texas, who seems at least inclined to enforce the law? What can he do that he's not doing, if anything?
I want to say he's doing probably as much as he can do. Governor Abbott started Operation Lone Star. He's taken troopers from other parts of Texas, 1,000 of them, and brought them to the border, stretched them out from El Paso all the way to Brownsville. He's deployed additional National Guard resources. But these governors are fighting an uphill battle because at the end of the day, they lack the legal authority to do a whole lot except try and interdict. In the case of Governor Abbott, they've turned over to the Border Patrol over 30,000 illegal aliens since this started, not to mention weapon seizures or narcotic seizures, but they've turned those things over to the Border Patrol. And they've also turned over those 30,000 illegal aliens. Well, the Border Patrol is still stuck abiding by the current policies. And those policies have watered down to where we know we don't have the detention space to handle all of the people that are illegally entering. Under the previous administration, some of the most shocking agreements that I thought of, like the Remain in Mexico, where even if you're not a citizen of Mexico, we're going to return you back to Mexico. Mm-hmm. That never happened in 31 years of me being in the Border Patrol. It happened under the last administration, and that relieved us from having to detain these people and ultimately release them for that lengthy asylum process. So I think the governors have their hands tied. They can do as much as they can to make the highway safe, but at the end of the day, they don't have control over those pull factors, what our policies are that encourages folks to come into the United States. And sadly, in those 30 years until the very end, I really never saw illegal immigration used as a political weapon. There's always been discourse and debate, but it's never been used to show that either one administration could do something that another one could. And I think a perfect example of that is if you go look for the latest caravan, the latest migrant caravan that was going to come to the United States, that was in January. We haven't heard the word caravan since then. However, the numbers have increased. And I think the difference is that was employed as a tactic to say, let's gather in mass, no greater numbers than in before, but let's gather in mass as a political tool, and let's try and come in and force our way in to show that, hey, this administration is going to be inhumane, and they're going to discourage this, and it will not look good politically. I think that was a politically motivated tactic, because we're not seeing caravans now, but we are seeing greater numbers. And what they're doing is they are not forcing their way across open border ports of entry. They're using surreptitious manners to get into Mexico, near Tapachula, cross rivers, in those smuggling routes that have existed for decades down there. They can move thousands a day to get to the United States, and they do it under the cover of darkness. They're rarely seen, and they're rarely ever looked at, and we don't see them on the news. So that's where we are right now, and it's kind of a scary place.
Well, what about the cooperation that we had with the Mexican government? Because I'm sure this has been problematic for them in many, many ways, but is it easier for them now that the floodgates have been opened up on the United States border?
It most certainly is, but I think a lot of pressure came off of those governments when this new administration took over. When those agreements were pretty much just set aside, they no longer had to do things to hold that back. If they're not going to have to accept an asylum claim in Mexico from folks that make it across their border, it makes it very easy for them to focus on other things. Really, I think the migrant community, the illegal alien community, I think they really suffered under the caravan, because when those groups had to come into Mexico in mass and they stuck around because they had to take asylum claims, I think a lot of the local population in Mexico took offense to some of the services they saw getting rendered to these migrants that were Central Americans that they were not receiving in their own communities. And they saw the amount of money that was spent a day in those communities in Mexico, and they were asking their government, well, why am I not getting free health care? You have clinics in these camps. Why am I not getting it? And so I think the tide and the sentiment changed amongst residents and citizens of Mexico on how they viewed the Central American migrants.
So why is that not happening here? I mean, I know it is to some extent, some people asking the question, but where's the critical mass of Americans asking the same questions?
I think that's a very good question, and I think it's really, if I had to make an analogy, I think it's like the frog that you put into the cold water and slowly raise the temperature that does not jump out. It's a process that's going to take a while to play out, and I think when the effects finally hit, then I think Americans may take note, hey, this is costing me now, and how do I deal with this, or how do we undo it? And it's going to be very hard there. If you look at what statistics say, there's about 20 cities that illegal immigrants normally move to. The number one is Los Angeles, California. Well, we know they have around 40,000 homeless people that they have to find shelter for under a court order. They got 180 days. Well, that's the number one destination for illegal immigrants in the United States of America. So when you look at that, that's going to compound those problems eventually, because at the same time, you see a lot of wealthier residents. New York is number two, by the way. you see a lot of residents that are in that category of high wealth that are leaving. You see the Oracles, you see the Elon Musk, that they're moving out of those places, which is going to remove revenues and tax dollars. And you see a primarily needy demographic coming in. They're very hard workers. That's the one thing I'll say is most illegal immigrants, 90% are very hardworking folks. They're non-criminals. However, it's very hard to sustain yourself in the United States on minimum wage earnings. It's very hard. So they're going to have to be subsidized in some sense to have a living wage and to be able to prosper. So somebody's going to pay for that. And I think in years to come, we may come to the conclusion that we should have acted now.
Randy Clark, I want to go to the national security aspect of all of this, and I want to start out with the concept of sovereignty. I think a lot of people haven't been taught that, at least in the present generation. They have no idea what it means. Why is that an important concept in our border protection?
Well, I think all you have to do is look at other countries. And I think, you mentioned inspections around the Canadian border, but there are rules and laws in every single country. If I want to go to Mexico, I'm free to do that as a visitor and as a tourist. But about 20 miles from the border, as I'm facing the interior, there is a checkpoint, much like Border Patrol checkpoints, and they're going to ask me, well, where's your visa to come in here? Mm-hmm. And if I do not have one for a specific purpose, I'm not getting in. That's just the truth of the matter. And if other countries were any different, they wouldn't require passports either. So sovereignty is pretty much a universal term. Most countries have their immigration laws, and they're very strict on them. I just don't think we're teaching civics to children. I don't think we're teaching those things right now in our educational institutions, even in the ones of higher learning. We are promoting an ideology that says, open everything up. And you can kind of see that. It's very dangerous. It's a very dangerous concept.
So I want to go to some of this very specific dangers, again, that people aren't talking about. The terrorism risk, what they call OTMs, other than Mexicans crossing the border, maybe from places in the Middle East that mean America harm. What evidence do we have of that?
Well, if you look at what DHS says themselves on their website, we have something that we call significant interest aliens. And those are defined as a person who we look at travel patterns that potentially pose a national security risk and come from a country that is known to have some terrorist activity. Well, DHS estimates about 10 per day are intercepted that are on that terror watch list. That's over 3,500 per year. So that's very alarming because that tells you the ones that were interdicted. That does not tell you the ones that were not interdicted. So that figure that I gave you from October to now of 200,000 that have eluded apprehension, well, the answer is we do not know who they are. Just a week ago here in Texas, in South Texas, very close to where I'm at, about 30 miles up the road, a sheriff's deputy stopped a vehicle, and there were two Pakistani nationals in there. We don't know much more than that because that's probably, if there is a nexus to terrorism, if there is, it's going to be quickly classified, and for good reason. The American population will not find out what we have thwarted until a case is completed. It may be 2 years from now. So those are dangers that we see that really don't come to light. But if you look at DHS numbers, you're looking at about 10 per day. To me, that's significant because we remember on 9/11 that it was 19 hijackers that did the damage that they did. Well, that's 10 per day on a terror watch list. And I think as Americans, as sad as it is, because I was working on 9/11, we heard the mantra for how long after that we will not forget. We will never forget. Sadly, I think a lot of Americans have forgotten. I think we have forgotten because we are dealing with an ideology that is extremely patient. If you look at the time frame from the first attack at the World Trade Center, I believe it was 1993-ish, they waited until 2001 to make the second try. And it was very well calculated. And it was a very, drawn out plan to learn how to fly planes. And we missed the boat. Honestly, we missed the boat on that one. And we didn't intercede in time to prevent that. What could our enemies that never stop thinking of us as their enemies, what are they planning right now? Are they so decimated that they're regrouping? Or are there factions that are looking and saying, okay, here's a vulnerability? Well, as someone who worked in border security for over 32 years, I will tell you, this is probably one of the greatest times of vulnerability that we have seen. We have an open border. People can say it's not. I'm telling you, it is.
I hope there are people with that perspective in decision-making positions. Randy, I want to talk now about the impact on employee morale, and also if the unions are able to provide protection for these employees if they speak out or if they have complaints or sound the alarm, because I'm very concerned that they're just going to give up.
Well, so that's a leadership challenge that the folks in D.C. that run the outfit and the local leaders and sector border patrol chiefs, I know some of them personally very, very closely, and I know they're doing everything they can to support their employees. I'm also very familiar with the union processes, and I speak to some of those folks almost on a weekly basis, and I know they're very concerned right now. The Border Patrol has never been a really luxurious ride. It seems like one crisis moves into another and moves into another. This one, I think, is probably the greater of all of them, but they are overwhelmed and they're pretty much at the grindstone all day long. I know the morale is suffering, but I also know the toughness of the Border Patrol, and I know they're going to hang in there, and I know they're hoping for some change.
In looking at what this administration, the Biden administration, is doing to the United States military, I think subverting the mission in many ways, I'm concerned that they could subvert ICE or the Border Patrol or other related agencies just by changing out people in key positions. Do you have any concerns for that?
Well, I think we're seeing that now. I think if you start to look ahead, you're seeing some of the nominations for ICE leadership, CBP leadership, and they are folks who come from the civilian ranks of law enforcement that are not very friendly towards ICE and the mission. And so it kind of goes against any kind of logic that if you're going to pick the leader of an organization that has a mission set that is enforcement related, that you're going to pick that kind of a person that is going to forward that mission. And I think we're seeing the opposite. We're seeing some folks that really would rather release a criminal alien on the street than to call an ICE agent and allow that person to get removed. But we've gone a step further, and I'll give you an example. Because of those priorities, we're seeing folks who have been previously removed from the United States get prosecuted for their illegal entry, and upon release, that's no longer a Border Patrol matter. That's a matter for ICE to conduct the removal part. They're being told, just let them go because we have limited resources. Well, the border is a mile away. To conduct a removal is less than a gallon of gas. So that resource might be $2.50 worth of gas, and they're told, release them. Does not meet the priorities. I think we're already there.
It's very disconcerting, but I've got to ask you finally, Randy Clark, are there any signs of hope in all of this?
Well, I think it's going to take a lot of Americans realizing that this is not where we need to be, but I just don't see any impetus at the highest levels of government right now to change that. I think this is the great experiment because this has never happened before. When I got into the Border Patrol, Ronald Reagan was on his last year. After that, we went into the Democratic administrations. After George Bush came in, we had Clinton. We had later on George W. Bush. And what we found was those transitions involved only minor change. In fact, if you look back and you ask, well, who deported more people? The Cato Institute says since 1892, Democrats have. The one that has deported the most people is Barack Obama. President Obama, on average, each year, over 300,000 deportations. President Trump, in his last year, about 280,000. So there was a difference. And of course, there's variables in that as to how many illegal aliens entered the United States. In the case of the last administration, more people were discouraged from coming. So he might have beat that record, who knows? But it's still held by President Obama. So when those transition came, really the agents didn't have that sense that I'm going to be given an entirely different mission set. Instead of that ship maybe turning 15 degrees one way or 15 degrees the other, the ship now has turned in the opposite direction. And that's very hard for folks who have a sworn oath to protect the country, who are now being told, hey, let them in. Just let them in and let them go. Because when you start dealing with incredible volumes, what you see is some of the processes drop off. And one of the big ones is the issuance of NTAs. And so what normally happens in a removal process is if I were to arrest an illegal alien and that alien says, I don't want to return to Mexico or I'm from Central America and I would like a deportation hearing, or I want to apply for political asylum, I'm going to issue what's called a notice to appear. That's a charging document, just the same as a traffic ticket is. Just the same as a traffic ticket. That says you have a date in court and you need to present your case, and then we're going to make a decision whether we remove you from the United States or you are amenable to some kind of relief. The volume got so high that we suspended that for the first time in my career ever in March. Never saw that before in 32 years, and all of a sudden, we are not issuing charging documents to certain groups of migrants in South Texas because of the volume. So in other words, I'm not going to track these people. The Border Patrol is not going to track these people. What they're saying is, when you get to your destination, whether it's New York, Los Angeles, Dallas, any other city in the United States, could you please go tell the immigration courts that you're an illegal alien and that they need to start working to deport you? You can see the preposterousness of that suggestion. And it's the same would happen to you and I. If you got stopped by the Highway Patrol on the way home and he said, you know, Rob, you're going 70 and a 60. I'm not going to give you a ticket, but could you please go to the next municipal court and tell them you were speeding on the way home? Yes, sir. Most people are not going to do that. To even expect that could occur, and even a small number of cases, is absolutely preposterous. So we are creating now another class of aliens that we're going to have to deal with in 5, 10, or 15 years. That class of aliens is where they're going to give them a name, either like the Dreamers or what have you. We're going to have to decide, how do we make these people whole? Because we didn't get them in a process. And what that means to law enforcement and the Border Patrol is, when you do get that ticket and you don't go to court, you're going to have a warrant for your arrest. So the next time they stop you speeding, you're going to go to jail. So that's what propels you to go to that court. Well, we're going to have folks that normally, if they would not appear at their hearing, they're going to be removed in absentia. In other words, the judge is going to decide, well, you didn't show up, means you don't have a case. I'm ordering you removed from the United States. Well, that person could be running around anywhere. But when he gets arrested for a criminal offense, or he's encountered by immigration authorities, ICE, Border Patrol, he's taken to the nearest port of entry with no appeal rights, and he's removed from the country. So the consequences is really what are being removed. And once you remove the consequences, you just encourage the behavior.
Randy, if people want to read your work on this topic, where's the best place to do that?
Most of my work is featured on Breitbart News.
I hope people will take advantage of the opportunity because it's such an important subject, and I hear the frustration in your voice, but I'm glad that you persist. Randy Clark, thank you so much for joining us today on the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast.
Thank you, Rob. Have a wonderful day.
That concludes another edition of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Visit us online at shillingshow.com, where you can directly support this podcast by clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page and making a monthly donation. Your support is essential for the continuation of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Until next time.